It would be nice if we could write one single workout that was perfect for each and every swimmer. Unfortunately, that's not reality. To help each swimmer improve as much as possible, we have to do our best to ensure that each swimmer is getting what they need. Hi everyone, Andrew here, helping you help your swimmers get faster. How do you manage different ability levels in the same practice? That's what we deal with in coaching. Regardless of the level, we're all working with swimmers with different abilities and different skill sets. If we want to help each and every one of them, we have to find a way to make it all work. There's going to be different levels of skill, there's going to be different levels of fitness, and there's going to be both. And to help swimmers improve as much as possible, we have to account for that. And it takes a slightly different approach to deal with differences in fitness versus differences in skill. When we have different levels of fitness within the same workout, there's some sets, there's some things that some swimmers simply can't do. They simply can't achieve what's being asked of them. They simply don't have the speed, they simply don't have the fitness to make it happen. And when that's the case, we're going to need to change the structure of the set to ensure that they're successful. So the first aspect of it is the volume. So how far are they swimming? How long are the repetition distances? And how many repetitions are they doing? Less fit swimmers are not going to be able to hold it together for as long, and they're not going to be able to hold it together for as many repetitions. And so you have to think about that. What are the swimmers able to do? What are the swimmers able to manage? And if you have one starting point, you're going to have to adjust that down for some swimmers in order to allow them to be successful. That might mean that they're going shorter distances. That might mean that they're not going quite as long, but it's a strategy that you can use to make sure that swimmers are challenged in a way that's appropriate for them. And in many cases, they can handle the distances, they can handle the repetition numbers, they can handle the repetition distances, but they can't handle the intervals because they're simply too fast. It doesn't allow them to get enough rest. So the simplest solution is just to add rest to the interval to allow swimmers to get more recovery so that they can maintain the necessary skill, the necessary intensity over the course of a set. This is a particularly simple strategy because all you have to do is just add extra rest. You don't have to change the set itself in order for swimmers to be successful. All that you need is to ensure that you have the necessary lane space so that you can have multiple intervals running at the same time. Then you can also change the speed expectations. Again, some swimmers may be able to maintain a certain level of skill for a certain volume. However, they can't do it at a certain speed. And so in that case, you just let them slow down a little bit. You change the speed expectations for the swimmers that aren't quite as fit. So you can keep the set pretty similar. You're just not asking them to swim quite as fast. And sometimes that's directly related to the recovery intervals that you give them, and sometimes that's not. So if it's a set where they're getting a lot of rest and giving them more rest isn't necessarily going to change much, you just might have them not try to swim quite as fast because it's not something that they can sustain or maybe even achieve in the first place. So if swimmers can perform the basic activity that you want pretty well, however, they can do it at varying levels of intensity, you might need to adjust the volume. You might just need to give them more rest. You might just have to have them swim a little bit slower, or you might have to do some combination of the three. And that's a way that you can create the appropriate physical challenge for them that's aligned with their fitness so that they can be successful. If they don't have the fitness to do something, it doesn't matter how hard they try. Nothing really matters because they don't have the fitness to make it happen. So you have to adjust the set to make sure that their fitness allows them to accomplish the goals of the set. Next up is accounting for different levels of skill. So if everyone's trying to improve a certain skill, different swimmers are going to need to be challenged in different ways in order to create an appropriate challenge that encourages them to learn but doesn't result in constant failure. One way to make the adjustment is to make a task more complex or simpler in order to challenge different levels of skill within the same set. So for instance, let's say everyone is working and they're trying to hit a stroke count and they're trying to hit a certain speed. That's kind of the middle range. For some swimmers, you might want to challenge them even more and give them a dolphin kick expectation so that they have to make all those changes while they swim. They can't just take more dolphin kicks, and that will make it more difficult. And then for some swimmers that are struggling, you might take away the speed requirement so that they just have to hit the stroke count, or you can take away the stroke count requirements so that they just hit the speed. We're making it simpler for the swimmers that are struggling a little bit, and we're making it more complex for the swimmers that are having almost too much success. They're not being challenged. Another way to make an adjustment is if swimmers are really struggling to pick up a skill, you can use more isolated drills that really isolate the skill in question, allow them to feel it, and then kind of work back up from there. One of the challenges that they face is that some swimmers just can't pick skills up in the same way that others can. And if they're struggling to pick it up while they're doing some sort of more complex swimming drill, you might need to isolate that skill a little bit more. So if they're struggling to hold water in freestyle, something like underwater recovery or even power poles might be a more appropriate option for some swimmers as opposed to trying to swim with stroke counts and resistance. And the opposite is true as well. If some swimmers aren't really getting much from an isolated drill because it's just too simple for them, give them something that's a little bit more advanced and a little less isolated. You can also use different drills. Some swimmers are going to struggle with certain drills. They're not going to get much out of it, whereas other swimmers are going to be really successful with those same drills and then struggle with other drills. So try to match the drills that you're using for the swimmers in front of you and give them multiple options. Maybe let the swimmers choose so that they can figure out which one is going to work best for them and what's going to be the best option to help them learn the fastest and the most effectively. It's all about identifying what their skill level is and then figuring out what's going to allow them to be successful. You might have to scale it up, you might have to scale it down, depending on what they're at. You're looking for a challenge, but a challenge they can do. The last aspect here is the logistical aspect. How do you make it all work? The first option is to keep the set exactly the same. And then within that, you can have swimmers skip a repetition if it's too difficult. So for instance, if it's 12 100s and some of your swimmers are on the lower end and that's going to be a real challenge, you could have them skip every fourth repetition or every third repetition. That way they get a little bit more rest, but they can still stay within the overall structure of the set. Another option is if they're doing 12 100s, you could have them do some or all of those repetitions as 50s to make sure that they can hold things together, again, while keeping the same basic structure of the set. That allows them to get a little bit more rest and they don't have to do something completely different. And then perhaps the simplest option is just to have them go slower. And of course, this assumes that the interval allows them to do that. If the interval doesn't allow them to do that, they're going to have to use a different option, or you're going to have to create a new group and give them a new interval. Which brings us to the next strategy, which is different versions of the same set. So again, say you have that set 12 100s, we can modify that in several ways to help swimmers be more successful. So we could go 12 75s, we could go 12 125s, we could change the interval, we could change the number of repetitions. There's a lot of different ways to have the same basic concept, have the same basic idea for all swimmers, but we're just going to scale it, we're just going to adjust it to make it a little bit more difficult, a little bit harder. So you can have an A, B, and a C version. Maybe the A version has the tightest intervals and the C version has the slowest intervals, or the A option goes 125s, the B option goes 100s, and the C option goes 75s. It doesn't really matter. It's just the principle. You have the same idea and you just make it a little bit more difficult or a little bit less difficult depending on the swimmers. And then you group swimmers according to their abilities. From a skill perspective, you can change the skill development strategies. So you can add elements or take elements away. So for instance, if they have a stroke count, they have resistance, and they have to swim with closed fist, you could either add speed to that too, or maybe you take away the closed fist. You make it more difficult by adding different things, and you make it less difficult by taking those away. You can also change the drills if you're using drills, or you can have them use different types of drills. You can also use different training aids. So for instance, you can take a parachute off, it's going to make it a lot easier. You can give someone fins, that's going to make it a lot easier. Or you can take away fins, it's going to make it a lot more difficult. Or you can add a parachute, that's also going to make it more difficult. Changing what they're doing from a skill development standpoint, making things easier, making things more difficult, is another way to change what's happening during the same basic set. The last option, which sometimes you have to use, is just to make a different set. You can have a set that's kind of similar but pretty different, or you can just start completely over and have a completely different set. The advantages is that it tends to give swimmers more of what they need because the set's kind of designed for that group of individuals. The drawback is you have to manage multiple sets at the same time. When you just have different intervals, it's a little bit easier to handle. When you have two completely different sets, that makes it more challenging. And if you have an assistant or you have multiple assistants, it's a lot more doable. It's still doable by yourself. You just have to make sure that you're ready for that and you're able to manage that. If you can't manage it very well, you're probably going to have to use different options. And there's certainly cases where it's just not manageable because there's too much going on and swimmers need too much attention. So to make things work as easily and as effectively as possible, you want to keep things pretty similar with as few variations as possible. However, you need to do what's ever necessary to provide swimmers with the appropriate challenge. One strategy I found very useful is to explain to swimmers why things are different and why it's specifically done for them. That tends to get a lot more engagement, a lot more buy-in, and they tend to do a lot better, and they execute those sets a lot better without specific guidance by you and without you having to watch each and every swim, which becomes really difficult when you're managing multiple workouts or different versions of the same workout at the same time. If you want to learn more about the skills that every swimmer needs to learn, check out the video here.